So imagine you've got 300 Lego bricks on the table in front of you. And I ask the question, how many objects are there? It's not a trick question. The obvious answer is there are 300 objects because there are 300 Lego bricks, right? So then I say, okay, play with the bricks, build some stuff, and use all the bricks. So let's say you build a fire station, 2 cars, a motorcycle, and an airplane, right? And use all the bricks. So then I ask, how many objects are there? Well, the answer now is 5. Yeah, 5. And then I say, dismantle it all again. You do so. How many objects are there? 300, right? But how can you have 2 different answers when it's all the same stuff? Were the airplane, 2 cars, motorcycle and fire station, were they somehow different from the pile of bricks? No, right? And yet, now some of you are going, well, it's obvious what you're talking about, there's no great mystery here, but I'm going to try to use this to trigger an insight about the nature of reality, right? Because you know that I subscribe to non-duality, right? The whole universe is one essence. It's not fundamentally made up of objects, right? So I can take 2 objects here. There's a pair of scissors and a pen, right? And I can say the universe is one. So these are really one. I don't want to say one thing. I want to say one essence. That's the best word I can use. Now, you're going to say, oh, well, that's obviously absurd. Look, these are 2 separate items. They don't intermix with each other. They're not one in any practical sense. And that's true, but the key word there is practical. They're not one in any practical sense. So in what sense are they one? Well, they're one in an atomic sense, right? So the Lego analogy is analogous to the materialistic structure of the universe as consisting of atoms, right? Now you might be thinking that the atomic view of reality is a fairly modern one. It's actually not. It goes way back to ancient Greece. There was a group of philosophers called the atomists. And I was learning about them recently because I've been studying Epicureanism, and it turns out that Epicurus was an atomist. Now you might wonder, how did ancient man, we're talking, I don't know, 400 or 500 BC or thereabouts, how did ancient man come up with a theory that the universe consisted of atoms, or that objects consisted of atoms? It wouldn't have been all that difficult actually, because if you do something like rub 2 rocks together, you know, the rocks are going to get smaller and smaller, and there's going to be particles coming off them. Or if you just take a piece of paper, or parchment as it would have been back then, and you hold one piece of parchment up, and you then say, okay, that's one object, but I can tear it down the middle. Now I've got 2 objects, right? So if a single thing can be separated out, then it must consist of lots and lots of tiny little things, and we're going to call them atoms, right? So it's a, which is a negation, as in no or non, in front of tom, which means divisible. So an atom is that which is non-divisible, the fundamental stuff, the fundamental bits of reality. So we use the word atom in our modern science. But then we discovered that the atom wasn't the end of the picture. We could get inside the atom and discover the protons, neutrons and electrons. And then you can get inside those and discover quarks and all kinds of weirdness that I don't know how to explain because I don't really understand it. Get into quantum mechanics and all that, right? So what the Greeks meant by atom is really what we mean by elementary particle, okay? But I don't want to get into all that now. I want to keep it simple, because I think even just taking a basic materialistic view of the world and universe as consisting of atoms materialistic, it still leads you to non-duality. That understanding, it still leads you to non-duality. So, what I want you to understand is that when you look at any object, you're not looking at one thing. You only think it's a thing because you attached a name to it and it has a practical significance for your life, right? You know, if you stand away from a forest, you can look at all those trees together and think of them as a single thing called forest, a single entity with a clear boundary. But if you're walking through the forest, you realize you're surrounded by lots and lots of smaller entities called trees. You can even, get into the tree and separate the bark from the leaves and whatnot. Then you can get in further and look at the atomic structure of a tree, right? So things just get smaller and smaller. So we're talking about something here called, and I'm pausing because this is hard to explain, we're talking about something here called ontology, right? The word ontology is the study of how we know what's fundamentally real. It examines the question, what is fundamentally real? If you ever hear the word epistemology, it's similar, but it's the question of how do we know what is true? Epistemology is to do with truth, ontology is to do with reality. What does reality fundamentally consist of? Now, as you go about your day, you're not thinking about that, and your basic mode of consciousness makes the view that everything you name and everything that separates itself out as an object is fundamental to reality. But that's not true. Every object is just an aggregate of atoms, right? This is an aggregate of atoms. This pair of scissors is an aggregate of atoms. And the Lego brick analogy, sticking the bricks together is analogous to the chemical bonds of the atomic structure of these objects that turns them into solids, right? So they still look separate, right? Except in between these two objects and all around me are other atoms, oxygen, right? The chemical bonds are different, so they don't manifest as solids. They're all floating around, right? Or sorry, molecular bonding. I shouldn't use the word chemical bonding, probably. Molecular bonding. It's different. So, but there's nothing foundational to the nature of reality to the point where solid meets gas. You understand? We're all swimming in one essence here of atoms. You see? So, when you use a noun like scissors, that's not fundamentally real. It's only practically real. What is more fundamentally real is the atomic structure of each individual atom, of the scissors, of the pen, of the air, of the entire universe, right? Things that you name are not fundamentally real as objects. You have to get to the smallest possible objects to get anywhere with this, right? So there's an object here called Darrell Sloan, right? And where you are, there's an object called fill in your name, okay? So you tend to think of yourself as fundamentally real, but you are just an aggregate of atoms, right? Your entire body is just an aggregate of atoms. And your entire brain is just an aggregate of atoms. And your brain is what's responsible for most of consciousness. I do think consciousness has metaphysical roots, and we may get to that. But the actual consciousness is very much dependent on brain function. Stick an axe in your head if you want to dispute that. So yeah, I'm losing my train of thought here. But to say that there is a fundamentally real object called Darrell Sloan materialistically is a fiction. It's not real. I'm not real. I'm just an aggregate of atoms. And if I want to make myself real, what do I say? That there's a soul atom, like a single, is there a single atom that we call a soul atom? A very small thing, and that's like who I really am. And around the soul atom is this big aggregate of body and brain that's responsible for so much, but it's not the real me. There's just a little soul atom. See how weird this gets when you start to think about it at this level? But without the big aggregate of the brain, you don't even have a personality, you don't have memories, you don't have anything. So there's really no self. Although consciousness kind of makes it feel like there is a self. But that's just because, practically speaking, there's a boundary condition where skin meets air. And you can move about and have mobility and have thoughts and feelings and all that sort of thing. But that's not ontologically true as something foundational to reality. The jargon's getting a bit more technical than I intended here, but I hope you're kind of starting to get the gist of what I'm doing here. Everything in the whole universe consists of atoms, right? What makes you so special that you're not that, right? But it's interesting that there is the feeling of being fundamentally real. Right? And yet that can't be so, because all aggregates are just larger pseudo-objects made out of more fundamental objects. Groups of more fundamental objects. You see what I mean? So, because there's no boundary condition between the edge of your body and the rest of the universe, there's no separation between self and universe. Which is precisely why my book is called I Universe, right? It's not a statement of ego saying, I'm the universe. It's a statement that says, there's no self here, right? The personality is just an aggregate. And what is consciousness? Well, the reason why, the idea of a consciousness atom is a bad idea. First of all, it feels wrong as an idea, as a theory, but we only cling to this idea that we must refer to oneself as an object because we're so used to thinking in terms of objects. Why not just say consciousness is not an object? Consciousness is a process, right? Just like turning fossil fuel into motion is a process that you do with the big aggregate of the internal combustion engine and the even greater aggregate of the car surrounding it, right? All those atoms stacked together that we've engineered to turn fossil fuel into motion. There's a process there, right? You don't find an atom called turning fossil fuel into motion, right? Just like you don't find an atom called the activity of consciousness, right? It's a very mysterious thing, consciousness. But it doesn't need to be defined as an object. Let go of the idea that there is a self. It's not necessary. It doesn't mean you're not real, but you're only real as an experience, not as an object. You see? Yeah. Clear as mud, right? If you take one thing away from this, get used to the idea as you walk around, observing life, get used to the idea of looking upon every object you see as an aggregate of much smaller objects. And maybe this will kind of sink in, especially as you talk to other people and realize that this thing you're looking at, this conscious, very real thing you're looking at, is an aggregate of much smaller objects. It's not an object in and of itself. And maybe this will click. Pointers to non-duality. It's the best I can do. Alright folks, take care.